All right, we are going live. Okay, so I wanted to redo yesterday's lecture, which almost everybody was at because there was some technical difficulties in the beginning and the end. But I just wanted to go over it and also make it available, which is something I didn't do last time. But before I start, I want to say just for those who missed, if you want to give your presentations, you have a couple options. You can do a video as I'm doing now. You can project your slides in the back. You can have your slides in the front. They don't have to be in the frame. You can send them to me. You can record, like use iMovies and have your slides and do a voiceover on it, send that to me. Just for a variety of ways that you can send that to me, and I will go ahead and grade it. So we don't have a way of presenting them to the class right now. So just get them to me and do your 15-minute presentation or however long it is, and I'll grade you. For those of you who have submitted your papers, those are all graded. You have comments. As always, my email and everything are on the syllabus. Contact me, whatever you need. If you need help, these are uncertain times. We'll make it work. Just let me know what you need and how we can follow through. And so from now on, at the time and the date of our lectures, I'll send you all a link. I'll put it on Canvas. You join the YouTube live just like last time, and we'll do the class. And after that, I'll post the video on. But I am going to start taking attendance. So if you can make it for any reason, let me know. We'll make it work. But I still want to do that. Yeah, so we'll basically start in the 1940s. If you have notes, have those in front of you. And by the way, I'll post these PowerPoints on online after I'm done with it, so you can just take notes as you're following through. Um, I do type stuff in the chat room when we're doing live lectures, so for keywords and whatnot. Yeah, so where we left off last time, and for those of you who've seen this lecture, you can just go on the end. I'm just going to cover sometimes that I might have. In the 40s, when Reza Shah is coming into the scene, and he is confronted by this kind of a new solidified organization that is very much new in the history of Iran, which is the Majlis, or the parliament. And I use the word Majlis in order to kind of take away from the associations you might already have with the world parliament. And so he is not an absolute monarch as his dad was in sense of powers. Those trends do come back later. We'll cover them, but he is, there's prime minister rule. There's a new bureaucratic class, technocrats and whatnot that he has to make deals with. There are parties that exist now, coalitions, and there is the new development, even though a very small segment of the country right now that is kind of a petty bourgeois, right? Like city dwelling, working for the state or the companies and whatnot that are, especially in Tehran, Esfahan, and Shiraz. Those are up and coming. But most of the country is overtly living agricultural life, and they are illiterate for the most part. So yeah, so Reza Shah's dad is abdicated. So I want to talk about a couple of parties that exist at this point, or formidable powers that exist in Iranian politics right now. And one is the Tudeh party. Tudeh is the word that means mass or masses, and Tudeh kind of developed out of the 53. 53 was the name of the group. These were kind of leftist, social democratic, reformist people who weren't against that were under Reza Shah. This is Mohammad Reza Shah's dad, right? We only have two monarchs in the Pahlavi dynasty: Reza Shah, which I'll call him by that, and Mohammad Reza Shah. So for Mohammad Reza Shah's son, I might just use the word Shah, which just means king, but that's how he's usually, when you say Shah in Iran or to Iranian people, they usually think of the son, Mohammad Reza Shah. So the 53 were active under Reza Shah, Reza Khan's the first monarchist, and they were leftists, but they were intellectuals, but they were kind of very critical of Reza Shah's kind of dictatorship for it, right? Of the vast powers of his monarch, and I kind of have to be careful using words like dictatorship because monarchy is its own thing, right? It might share some similarities with a dictatorship, but these are two different forms. So maybe the arbitrary rule of the monarch would be kind of a better word here. So Reza Shah does jail the 53, but after his abdication, the 53 come back and they form the Tudeh party masses. This is still they're leftist, they're social democratic and reformist. So these people still believe in the parliament, representative model parliament. So they're not in the kind of a Soviet form or a Leninist form yet, though they do take those characteristics. And one of those characteristics in the early Soviet model, and I'm using the Soviet model because they see themselves as such. In the Leninist model, Lenin is very much against this idea of parliament and even the state, right? Because he says this idea of having a class of people that represent the lower classes and working classes and the peasants is a problem, right? It's a kind of a bourgeoisie solution to the immediate problems of the people. But the Tudeh is still their parliamentarian, right? They're not as radical and their Soviet counterparts, which they start forming relations with under Stalin, and then they become radicalized later. Well, we'll get to that. Even if in 1943, 8 members of the Tudeh do become part of the Majlis, right? So that is, they believe in the system, right? And they're definitely part of this city dwelling petty bourgeois class. So in early days, these are how they kind of understand themselves, and on part they are monarchies. They don't have a problem with the idea of a monarchy, like something that we have in England even today, right? There is a parliament, but there's a monarch. There's a prime minister, and these associations kind of deal with each other. They're monarchists, they believe in the parliament, and they were anti-fascist. But as I were told, talking about this a bit, the idea of anti-fascism, even with fascism, never took place. Took hold, fascist ideology in Iran. Even some parts of the identitarian aspects of it took place in Iran, like the Aryanism and whatnot, which continue to have a certain prevalence in Iranian society. The actual like fascist regime, right, of a party that is militaristic and connected to the military and controls every aspect of society. That does not take place in Iran, but they were anti-fascist, at least in the way they articulated their ideology. And later on, we'll come back to them but the Tudeh does transform. Another kind of force, and this is, there are a lot of forces at work here, but I'm just going to talk to the ones that I'm going to focus on to tell this kind of narrative leading up to the 1953 coup. And this other one is the National Front of Iran. Now, don't mistake this with the National Front that is a Eastern European white supremacist group like Golden Dawn and stuff. This has nothing to do with that. National Front was a nationalistic coalition within Iran, and their kind of most prominent member of them was Mohammad Mosaddeq. And Mohammad Mosaddeq, he lived from 82 till 1967. And Mosaddeq is an interesting character, and he's very prominent. Every Iranian knows his name because of his role later on as a prime minister to nationalize Iran oil. As you remember, the British are basically they control the southern part of Iran, especially in Pars region and the Gulf, and they extract all of Iran's oil. They don't pay taxes to Iran, but they also share very little of the revenues from the oil with Iran. They even have their own coalitions and police force, right? So they're an independent presence in Iran. And there's also the Soviet kind of interest in the oil that is being discovered now in the Caspian, in the northern part, right? So the Soviets are very much concerned about that area, and soon we'll see. I'll bring up some points that we've talked in previous lectures about how they conduct themselves there. Even so, Mohammad Mossadegh, yeah, and then Mohammad Mossadegh comes from the Qajar family, especially from his mother's side. His mother was a Qajar princess, so she was connected to this old the ruling force in Iran, this dynasty, this larger dynasty. And Mossadegh, much like Shah, so he grows up with getting Western education, especially in France. Most of his education happened in Switzerland. But if you, I invite you to look at the movie, that documentary that I sent you, that you have to write a reflection on. Just pay attention to how fluently, for example, Shaw switches to French and other languages, right? So this is part of being from young age educated abroad. And Mossadegh had the same kind of education. And as he comes back to Iran as a young man in his 20s, he serves a variety of roles, and this is not in chronology. I'm looking off screen because I have my notes here. I'm not distracted. So here are some of the roles that he had. He was a vali. He was like a represented a kind of governor of a province in Iran. And we talked about Iran has moved from states to provinces now under Reza Shah. So he was a vali of a province. He served as an ambassador, and his kind of the command of languages was useful in this, and his knowledge. He studied law when he was abroad, so he's kind of the perfect kind of technocrat. He's ambassador to the different countries. He was a member of a parliament at some point, so he's done his parliamentary work. He's a minister, and he's switched out as a minister between being foreign defense and foreign national defense, right? And this should kind of raise your eyebrow a bit, because as you remember, Reza Shah was very adamant that the military and its management was under him. Even if he elected someone or put in charge of it, he always, as a military man, he really wanted to have control over that aspect of his country, which, as I tell you a story, might not sound like a bad idea in Iran, which is still very new to this idea of being a uniform state. But yeah, so when we talk about Mohammad Mossadegh, we're going to discuss him as his prime ministership, okay? And a lot of these words that I say and put emphasis on, if you watch that documentary, which is subtitled and whatever, a lot of these characters do come up in this time. So Mossadegh has a long history in Iran. He even served under Reza Shah, and because of his Mohammad Reza Shah's dad, and because of his antagonism to Reza Shah's coronation, he was fond of parliamentary countries, which he saw were kind of gaining momentum in Europe. But even Europe, for a long part, came as it still does. Still has their monarchies. We don't hear about them, but they're still powerful entities in Scandinavia, Britain, all around. But he was one of those people that saw the project of modernity with this rise of the parliamentary forces and this decline of the monarchy, right? Because he saw, much like a lot of people, he was not a Marxist, but he would have seen the bourgeois revolutions of early 19th century this idea that the aristocracy had to give way to this new rising class, which is the bourgeoisie, which is the people who are in the industries, they're in bureaucracies and whatnot. So he said, and this had already happened in France in the French Revolution, again, where he studied, right? During the time of the American Revolution, had done this. Germany is always late to these revolutions, but they had and failed their own revolution in 1950s, right? This is the time that Marx is actually writing. A lot of social thinkers are writing. Even the Russians, who had not gone through the capitalist, the bourgeoisie rebellion against the between the lords and the aristocrats, and between the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie, they had, through kind of sheer force, had overpassed those levels and had begun to build industry. So the Mosaddeq has a kind of a first seat to this history, right? So this idea of getting rid of the Qajars, which was fine to do, but to have another monarch was kind of, even as a young man, he saw it as something of a stagnation, right? But he was also a pragmatist. So when he grows up, he kind of accepts that, yeah, monarchy in this state is just kind of have to be. But under Reza Shah, he was very opposite for. He was part of opposition to having this coronation. Actually, he was jailed in Khorasan for a bit for this opposition. So later on, after he comes out of jail, and later on when he's in the parliament leading up to his premiership, he becomes very famous, right? And one thing that he becomes famous for is this emphasis on, hey, if we're going to have a monarch, we're gonna have to empower the parliament, right? And the parliament can, it can kind of be a strong opposition to the monarchy and curtail the powers of the monarch, right? So, hey, if we're going to have a monarch, let's have something right the British are going to do, right? Even at that time, you're talking about Winston Churchill is the one that's calling the shots, right? The Queen is involved, right? And the Queen's family is involved, but the common man that has reached the processes of running a government, governing the state, is powerful. So to Mosaddeq's mind, it's like let's have more of that. But what we know, as I mentioned later on, is this one project that Mosaddeq kind of consolidates all his political goals in this, right? And that is the nationalization of Iran oil. So how are we going to be a modern state? We have to be independent, and not just independent for independence sake, but to be part of the world markets and the world bureaucracy and world the way the countries around the world deal with each other in the new world, rather than kind of strong arming each other, even though that's exactly what's going to happen continuing to present day, but at least on the face value, right? So how can Iran do this? Iran needs to own its own oil, right? Because Iran can rely on begging people for debts, which lead to concessions, right? And which leads to foreign involvement, which leads to corruption. Mosaddeq is like, we got to take over our oil and we got to use that revenue to build a better country. How to do this? We have to get rid of the British, right? And he's not a big fan of the Soviets either, even though later on they paint him as a communist. But you read about his life, read his writing, not close. Partly why they do that is that because they try to paint him as a communist, which is kind of still a popular move in the world of politics, is that Tudeh supported him, right? Tudeh is, again, unlike many kind of leftist group, is a nationalist force, right? None of that international existence of non-states and a global kind of communism. None of that. They're nationalists. Nationalism is big in Iran at this point. So let's kind of set these groups up that we talked about. And then there's a minor player here. This is, I have to be very careful. There's very little to say about this group, but because of our kind of modern prejudices, we might read too much in this. There is a tiny Shia kind of militia emerging in Iran at this time. They're called Fada'iyan Islam, which means the people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for Islam. Even that concept is not very developed at this time yet. We have to come to the 70s before this kind of idea of self-sacrifice becomes a thing in larger Islamic head language. Fada'iyan Islam, they're important because they do commit a couple of high-level assassinations, right? One of the most important one of them, I'll talk about another one later, is Kasravi, who was this kind of monumental, huge emerging Iranian intellectual who took a lot of issues with Islam as it existed in Iranian society and culture, and he saw it a part of problem of backwardness. If you, for those of you who were in the other lectures the previously, right, when we talked about Afghani and Tanzimat movement in Turkey, this idea that not anti-Islam but anti-having Muslims having not Muslim, Islamic establishments having too much say in the government and on the culture, right? So this is like, hey, there's been a scientific revolution. We need to join the world, right? Not very different than the Western intellectuals at that point. But these Fada'iyan Islam do assassinate them. So yeah, but they don't have that much coalition. They're not even connected to those establishment that I usually speak of in Qom, which is in Iran, and Najaf in Iraq. Or Iraq, as you pronounce it in English, they're not even connected to those groups because those groups are either quietists at this point. They're like, Islam shouldn't be involved with politics, right? Which has kind of been a dominant characteristic of Shiism since the Imam Hussein, right? Since more than 1,000 years ago, and they're part of them that have started to participate in the constitutional revolution, and now they are part of this parliamentary movement, right? And we talked about Ayatollah Nuri and stuff, some of them were against. So that's basically, if we're talking about Islamist movement right now, that's what it looks like. This Fada'iyan is very small. We just remember his history because of their assassinations, and they have no international connections. Those come later on, again, with the emergence of PLO in Lebanon and all that. And we'll talk about that later. There are also some riots and uprisings in the country. I almost say this in every lecture about every time in US, but that is just the state of Iran, right? You have, for example, you have the Qashqai revolt. Qashqai is one of those two major tribes that I spoke about. The Qashqai is the one in the south, which in our Pars lecture, I talk about that they were kind of forming coalitions with the British, right? The British had their army, but they also wanted this kind of pastoral, huge, nomadic tribe to be also part of their proxies. There is the Qashqai revolt. There are riots, especially again this in Kurdistan region, right? And as I put an emphasis on it in the live version of this lecture, Kurdistan and Azerbaijan, unless I indicate that I'm talking about those Azerbaijan as a country and Kurdistan as this larger Kurdish project that is parts of Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, not that one. When I say these words, Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, I'm talking about Iranian provinces, right? Iran has a lot of these country names or provinces in Iran, right? Which have those ethnicities, but a lot of these people consider themselves like Iranian Kurdish, right? Like, and they speak different languages. A lot of people are multilingual in Iran, except city boys like me. But yeah, so it's important to keep that in mind. But yeah, there were uprising in these regions. So this idea of having independent states becoming was kind of an antagonism to this nationalist ideology, right? We are Iranian and whatnot. Then the Kurds are like, well, we're not, we're not. We're actually Kurds and we want our own country. So there were uprising in this, and especially the one in Azerbaijan. We talked about the brief life of the Soviet in Iran, the Soviet of Azerbaijan in Iran, but they are more to the socialist side and they have connections to the Soviet Union under Stalin. Um, Now, some of you might say from previous lectures that, hey, wait a minute, I thought there was this tripartite agreement that, yeah, the British violated immediately, but Russians promised to stick with. Well, the Russians also got rid of it, right? After World War II, there was this. There becomes even before World War II, there becomes this kind of game change because by 42, 43, people realize that if we are to get rid of this existential threat that is the German state, we have to do something about the world. We have to, everybody has to grab as much land and protect it because we can't having these rogue states that rise to power and become literally excuse me, existential threat. So yeah, so Soviet is definitely neglecting the kind of elements of the tripartite agreement, and they're very active in Iran with the Soviet friendly groups, the socialist groups, mostly in Azerbaijan and on the Caspian shores, those provinces. And the last thing to mention here is the Pahlavi's nationalistic ideology. Of course, this is a little different from the. This is a very kind of a interesting subject, which we have to. I have to not kind of talk about it too much because then every lecture will take too much time. But let me kind of put it in this precise way, because the Pahlavi's nationalism is different than the Mosaddeq's nationalism, because Pahlavi's nationalism is mostly ideological, right? So these people believe, especially the Shah has this idea of connecting Iran, right, to its Achaemenids past, right? This past empire, and this is what all that talk in the first and second lectures were about, to show this country as an extension of the ancient pre-Islamic invasion, whatever that means, existence of the state and the empire, and that the Pahlavi dynasty is about to kind of reemerge that civilization, right? And then there is all kinds of modern notions written into this, such as conformity in language, right, which is put in action under Reza Shah, his dad. The idea of having been called Iran, the idea of having people being known as Iranians or Persians, and so that is also at work here, which kind of pisses some people off. But some people love it. Even people who are against monarchy, some of them do appreciate that kind of nationalistic project. There is a hiccup in the existence of Tudeh at the time, and this happens on February 4th, 1949, where one of the members of the Tudeh shoots the Mohammad Reza Shah in the face. There are pictures of this online of him in hospital, and he lives a good scar on his face. But this wasn't a plan by Tudeh. This was kind of a rogue agent that went ahead and did this. And the Shah, of course, survives, but he immediately disbands political parties, except especially the Tudeh party, and then he tries to dissolve the parliament, which he dissolves, but the parliament does come back. But he also begins this process of exiling one of these ulama, mujtahids, to be specific, which is Ayatollah Kashani, and he sends him to Lebanon. So this is kind of a turn in Shah. Shah's kind of feeling this boiling unrest that is such a strong part of the Iranian history. So here are some of this national projects of the Shah. There are different stages of it, but let's start in the 50s, because every decade or so they start changing and having other goals. One is that the Shah gets rid of all the military and the special courts outside the confines of the parliamentary laws, right? So in this, they're kind of in agreement. And if they're not in agreement, really, the parliament that he kind of dissolves temporarily for a bit is and comes back is a formidable power. It has popular support, right? There is in 1951, in September, there is a takeover of the Abadan oil, which is is right now controlled by the British. The workers rise up in Abadan and take control of the oil refinery, and which leads to the international boycott of Iran's oil. And this is a problem for even the people who appreciate this as nationalists, like Mosaddeq. This becomes a problem because it shows that the country is not like this. This wasn't like a legal international move as Mosaddeq had understood things to be happening. As for Shah, it just looks like he doesn't have a control of his country. So you already see that there's different versions of nationality, and people are acting on it in mass, sometimes by their own will. At this time, the British kind of appeal to the right wing of the Majlis, the parliament, to take control of this. The World Bank, the International Court of Justice in Hague, and the UN Security Council, which is kind of a big deal to this day, to some point, to help to repossess the refinery. But this effort fails because Mossadegh kind of turns and supports this overtake of this refinery. There is a brief kind of proposition by the British towards at Truman for a coup. I mean, at this point, coups weren't really a thing in the sense that we understand today. But President Truman is not for it, right? Truman is, at this time, it's interesting to read kind of American history at this time. Truman is very suspicious of this development of what comes known as CIA and all these kind of the extrajudicial or the secretive groups, right? Because he's a man that's lived through this and seen the idea of Gestapo and KGB and whatnot, and he's like, Jesus Christ, did we find it smart to have one of those in our own land, right? So CIA is, Truman is not for this idea of foreign involvement like that. He's also not for the idea of using a secret force to do so, which the British kind of want him to do, or at least need his support to do. Because Britain, as you know, after the war is devastated, right? On what other movements are happening at this time? There are a call for women's suffrage and to kind of to kind of begin reconstructing the country. But the moment suffrage movements, even though it has a lot of support from the parliament, does fail because again, the parliament has power with segment of a society, and it is kind of not in contact with the large majority of society that is still connected to the religious groups. But also the idea of suffrage is like Iran, like many countries, is a patriotic constructed society, but even men don't have that many systematic rights at this time, right? They have cultural rights or local rights, but in the kind of grand scheme of things, they're not, the average person is not that powerful or imbued with kind of defined rights. Anyways, so the early women's suffrage movement fails, and then then there is many kind of attempts to move away from this mono-economic industry, which is the oil, right? Because it's kind of a curse. If even if you nationalize it with something that does end up later, the people outside us will begin to see external powers can decide just not to buy your oil, right? Which is detrimental to your projects of modernization. There is partial domestic successes through the kind of the help of the parliament and the Shah at this time. One is that it becomes very clear in Iran that there needs to be a land reform, right? That you can't have this vast areas of lands that are owned by landlords, and then they have a lot of power over these peasants, right? Sharecropping, and that's sort of our idea, that which the most of the world has either moved on. I'm not going to say naturally or through Soviet means, but in one way or another, they have moved on off of this. But also the Shah, again, did not like this idea that he didn't have total control over the domain, right? And I'm not talking about in a cartoonish sense of I want all the land in Iran so I can build palaces or something. No, because the Shah was also a person who wanted a modern country, and part of the way to do this was to have control over the land to do things with it. Because when you have serfs and landlords, there's not, it's very different than having like an agricultural industry where you can export this stuff, import this stuff, control the prices, like to build capital in the other sense that can be used for financing, and you see where I'm going with this. So other than having powerful factions in Iran, he really wanted to control so he could expedite this project of modernization, and he was often met with antagonisms when it came to enforce these projects. But nevertheless, the parliament is successful to pass that the landlords would give 10% of the share of their output to the peasants, and another 10% would go to rural development, right? So this is in the 50s, again, put emphasis in this. And the monarch is still, and the parliament are still kind of forced to deal with the landlords like this, right? So that class still exists, that it does not exist in a lot of other parts of the world at this time. So they don't even abolish them, they have to make deals with them, right? Which is like, hey, let's share it more. Right, kind of how we deal with corporations right now, right? Like, can you please pay this much more, right? But you still have seat on the table to kind of challenge what is being offered to you, right? And at this time, the Shah is having a lot of problem with his prime ministers, right? Especially one is Qavam, Qavam, and the other one is Mosaddeq. And it kind of goes between these two and several other people. But he sees this idea of, again, another rising power, one, as he doesn't like having powers confronting him on the political scene, because after all, he's a monarch. But then he also sees this deliberate body that is this entity of the parliament as something that is um, slows things down, or sometimes they want to do things differently than he wants. Like, for example, I told some people that there for a decade from 40s to 50s, and this kind of extends in the 60s at some points where the parliament is like unable to pass bills, right? Kind of like our current predicament today, which has detrimental effects because the rest of the country is waiting for these laws to be passed so they can go forward, right? I mean, for example, in our Senate right now, we have like, I don't know, 300 something bills just sitting, right? Which Mitch McConnell is just going to say, "Hey, I'm not going to deal with these. Like, this is trash. Send me something else," right? This is the state of Iran, but imagine for like 10 years and a little more. So this is frustrating for not just Shah, but the most of these ruling entities of Iran. Um, uh, but by the end of the kind of, even though the Shah and Mossadegh have these kind of common ideas of how Iran should be, they butt heads nevertheless, right? As I explained, they have interests, but their interests are different enough to be problematic in the political sphere. Um, and Yeah, so basically this. And so I see that I've already gone on for 40 minutes, and I think watching videos, which I watch a lot of lectures, I think this is enough. And so I just kind of added a little more details than I had in for people who were present in last session. So kind of take this, re-listen to it, whatever. Yeah, just I put emphasis on it. If you can't come to class, if you need any help at this time for anything, please contact me. Please contact me. I want to give everyone A's. You don't need that to worry about, but we also need to work together. And we have the technologies to do it right now. Most of us do, some don't, and we have to help those folks to get through. We have each other in this class. We can help each other the best we can. So reach out to your classmates, but please don't hold back. We can get through to each other. You don't have the ability to kind of raise your hand here, ask me for clarification. So that's, if you want explanation and everything, just let me know. Okay, so I'm going to stop before 1953. That's where we are. The next, and we're going to have kind of our action spy movie lecture on Monday. Try to be there for it. And it's a very interesting topic. Anyways, yeah, thank you for watching this, and be safe, guys. All right, take care.